Friends dear, tired, brave, somewhat bewildered friends, let me begin not with a text, but with a confession. There was a season in my life, and some of you will know this season by its weather rather than its name, when I woke each morning with a quiet, persistent dread, not the sharp dread of a man about to face a lion. No, the duller dread of a man who is no longer sure the face in his mirror belongs to anyone worth knowing. I would dress, take my tea, open my books, and all the while, somewhere beneath the ordinary business of the day, a small and merciless voice would repeat, "You are less than you pretend to be." Perhaps you have heard that voice, perhaps, and I suspect this is why you are here today. You are hearing it still. Now, I want to say something to you with great care because careless words in wounded ears do terrible damage. I want to say that voice is not God's voice. And I want to tell you how I know because I did not always know it. And the discovery, when it came, arrived not like a sunrise, gradual and pleasant, but like someone throwing open a curtain in a dark room, startling, disorienting, and then, after a moment, gloriously, undeniably bright. Let me begin with something most sermons are too polite to say plainly. The majority of us do not actually know who we are. And what is more disturbing, what keeps me up at night far more than any theological puzzle I have ever wrestled with, is that we do not know, we do not know. We walk through our days entirely convinced that the self we carry around, the self we defend and apologize for and occasionally despise, is the real one. We treat it as a given, as furniture, as the floor beneath our feet, and we build our entire relationship with God on top of it, never once stopping to ask whether the foundation itself was laid by trustworthy hands. It was not. The portrait most of us carry of ourselves was painted before we were old enough to object to the artist. Consider what happens to a child in those first formative years, those years when the brain is soft as fresh clay and every word pressed into it leaves a lasting impression. A father who is absent teaches his daughter without a single spoken sentence that she is not worth staying for. A mother whose own wounds make her cold teaches her son. Without conscious intention, that tenderness is dangerous and need is weakness. A classroom of children, running as children do on pure social instinct, identifies the one who is different. Too clever, too quiet, too loud, too poor, too strange. And with the casual cruelty of the unaware, they press a name into that child that will echo in corridors of the soul for decades. These are not minor injuries. Do not let anyone tell you they are minor injuries. They are the original theft, the stealing of a self before the self had any means of resistance. And what makes it so terribly effective is that the child does not experience it as theft. The child experiences it as discovery, as truth, as the world simply telling them at last what they actually are. And so by the time the child has grown and found their way into a pew or onto their knees or through the door of some church hall on a desperate Tuesday evening, they arrive already defined, already labeled, already wearing a coat that was sewn for them by frightened, limited, sometimes wounded people who were themselves wearing coats sewn by others before them. Generation after generation of mistaken identity passed down as faithfully as eye color. The conversion experience, magnificent and real as it may be, does not automatically strip that coat away. This is the part we so rarely say honestly. You can be genuinely born again and still spend the next 30 years believing the lies you were handed before you were born the first time. Grace enters the heart before it renovates every room. And some rooms, the ones where those earliest voices still echo, Those rooms stay locked the longest, not because God cannot open them, but because we have quietly and quite understandably learned not to go near that particular door ourselves. This is the mirror problem. It is not a crisis of faith. It is a crisis of sight. We look in the mirror and we see the composite image assembled by everyone who ever looked at us with fear or judgment or indifference. We do not see what God sees when he looks at the same face. And the great and aching work of the spiritual life, the work that takes not a moment of conversion, but the whole long business of sanctification, is to let his vision slowly, stubbornly, mercifully replace ours. Until the day we look in the mirror and perhaps for the first time, with genuine conviction, recognize the face looking back at us as someone he specifically and deliberately made. Not accidentally, not reluctantly, not as a rough draft he settled for, but as an original, signed, intended, kept. That is where we must begin, not with what we have done, not with what has been done to us, but with the quiet and revolutionary act of allowing God to tell us from the beginning and without interruption who we actually are. There is a particular kind of loneliness that the publicly praised person knows better than most. It is the loneliness of standing in the light of someone else's applause and feeling with quiet devastation that the person being celebrated is not quite the person doing the standing. The crowd cheers a performance. The soul inside the performance knows with uncomfortable precision exactly how much was theater. We live in an age, and I suspect every age has been some version of this age that is enchanted by visibility. We have come to confuse being seen with being known, and being known with being loved. And so we perform, we curate, we present the most defensible version of ourselves to the world and hope with a kind of desperate sincerity that if we can convince enough people of our worth, we might eventually convince ourselves. But God is not in the crowd. This is the extraordinary and, at first hearing, rather unsettling truth at the heart of the second keynote. God is not applauding from the gallery. He is not impressed by the performance, not because he is indifferent to you, but because he is far too interested in the actual you to be distracted by the version you have put on stage. He walks straight past the performance, past the curated self, past the credentials and the failures alike, and he goes directly to the room you keep locked. The room with no audience, the room where you are most honestly, most uncomfortably, most undeniably yourself, and he knocks there, not loudly, but persistently. The prophet Elijah discovered this on the mountain. He had performed miracles of the most spectacular kind, fire from heaven, a nation confronted, 450 false prophets silenced in a single afternoon. And then, in the aftermath, he sat under a broom tree and asked to die. Not the request of a man managing his public image, the request of a man so completely alone with himself that he could no longer sustain the gap between who he appeared to be and who he felt himself to be. And what did God do? He did not send another fire. He did not arrange another spectacle. He sent an angel with bread and water and the simplest possible instruction. Get up and eat, for the journey is too great for you. No sermon, no rebuke, no public restoration ceremony, just food, rest, and the acknowledgement that the hidden, exhausted, deeply private Elijah was the one God was actually dealing with. That is the pattern. God consistently, stubbornly, tenderly bypasses the public self and addresses the private one. He is not speaking to your reputation. He is not speaking to your record. He is not even speaking to the version of yourself you bring to church on a Sunday morning, though he is grateful for that effort. He is speaking to the self that wakes at 3 a.m. and lies very still and knows things about itself that no biography will ever record. Because that self, the hidden, unperformed, unpolished self, is not a lesser self. It is not the self to be ashamed of and eventually replaced by something more presentable. It is, in the most precise theological sense, the real self, the one made in his image, however obscured that image may presently be, the one he is most urgently and most lovingly trying to reach. And here is the thought that ought to both humble and steady us. He already sees it, all of it. The private grief, the recurring doubt, the sin you have confessed 14 times and committed 15, the tenderness you show when no one is watching, the courage you exercised in a moment so small that only you and God were present to witness it. He sees the whole of it without flinching, without looking away, without revising his opinion of your worth. That is not a threat. That is the most stabilizing truth available to a human being. You cannot disappoint a God who already knows everything and chose you anyway. You cannot fall below a floor that was never raised on your performance in the first place. The weight of hiddenness, then, need not be the weight of shame. It can become, if we will allow it, if we will stop fleeing from it into busyness and noise and the comfortable numbness of constant distraction, it can become the very place where God speaks most clearly, in the hidden room, in the private hour, in the unperformed, unguarded, quietly desperate moment when there is no one left to perform for. That is precisely where he has been waiting to meet you all along. There is a peculiar arrogance buried in our expectation of how God ought to speak. We have constructed, most of us, an elaborate theater in our minds, a grand stage, dramatic lighting, perhaps a voice of considerable resonance, arriving at a moment we have deemed appropriately significant. We fast, we pray, we attend the appointed services, we arrange ourselves in attitudes of readiness, and then we wait for God to honor the stage we have built for him. And he, with what I can only describe as a sovereign and slightly mischievous disregard for our productions, chooses instead to speak beside a bush that is burning on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. This is the burning bush principle, and it runs like a quiet thread through the whole of Scripture if we have eyes trained enough to follow it. Moses was not on retreat when God interrupted him. He was doing the thoroughly unglamorous work of tending someone else's flock in the back country of the desert. Jacob did not encounter the angel of the Lord in a temple. He encountered him alone at night beside a river and walked away limping. Elijah, that magnificent and exhausted man, did not hear God in the wind that tore the mountains apart, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire, but in what the old translations hauntingly call a still, small voice. The prophet expected thunder. God sent a whisper. We make a grave mistake when we confine our expectation of divine encounter to the extraordinary. The ordinary is not God's second choice of medium. It is, if the evidence of Scripture is to be trusted, his preferred one. He is not interested in competing with our spectacle. He is interested in reaching us, and we are most reachable when we are least defended. The burning bush caught Moses' attention precisely because it burned without being consumed. It was strange enough to make a tired shepherd stop, turn aside, and look. Not a vision, not a dream, not an angel with a drawn sword, a bush, a small fire, a pause in an ordinary afternoon. I want to suggest to you, with great seriousness, that God is doing something very much like this in your present circumstances. The interruption you have been most eager to get past, the inconvenience, the unexpected detour, the conversation you did not plan, the book that fell open to the wrong page, the sleepless hour between 2 and 4 in the morning when the house is dark and something in you refuses to be quiet. These are not obstacles to your encounter with God. They may in fact be the encounter, dressed in clothes ordinary enough that you nearly walked past without looking twice. The invitation of the burning bush is always the same and always devastatingly simple. Turn aside and see, not run toward, not shout back, simply stop, turn, look. The ground you are standing on, however unremarkable it appeared a moment ago, may be, if God is in it, the holiest ground you have ever touched. There is a word we use far too casually in the church, and that word is sign. We have reduced it over centuries of sentimental use to mean something gentle and agreeable, a confirmation of what we already wish to believe, a divine nod in the direction we were already traveling. But I want to recover the word's original weight, because a sign, in the biblical sense, is almost never comfortable. It is almost always, to borrow a phrase that I find increasingly precise the older I grow, a sacred disruption. Consider how God has historically announced himself, not in the formats we would have chosen had we been consulted. A burning bush on an unremarkable afternoon, a still small voice after a wind that tore mountains, a star, not a proclamation, not a trumpet, but a star requiring years of patient, costly, uncertain following before it led anywhere at all. God is not, it seems, interested in convenience. He is interested in contact. And contact, real contact between the infinite and the finite, between the holy and the merely human, is by its very nature disruptive. You cannot touch fire without being changed by the touching. And so these three signs, the unrest that will not quiet itself at night, the encounter that arrives wearing the disguise of coincidence, and the hunger that your usual spiritual diet can no longer satisfy, must not be misread as problems requiring solutions. They are not malfunctions in your interior life. They are rather correspondence. They are God writing to you in the only language that gets through when all the polite languages have failed. He writes in restlessness when our contentment has become complacency. He writes in unexpected encounter when our routine has calcified into self-sufficiency. He writes in holy hunger when we have been surviving on too little for too long and have, through long habit, mistaken survival for abundance. The great tragedy I have observed, and I speak as a man who spent years being tragically observant in precisely the wrong direction, is that most people, when these signs arrive, do the worst possible thing. They manage them, they explain the unrest away with busyness or sleeplessness or the vague pressures of the season. They file the unexpected encounter under the category of pleasant accident. They address the hunger with religious activity, which is not at all the same thing as feeding it. And in doing so, they miss the message entirely. The letter arrives, is briefly felt in the hand, and is then set aside unopened. I want to urge you with everything I am able to urge, do not do this. When disruption comes, hold still long enough to ask, not how do I restore order, but what is this disturbing? For what God disturbs, he intends to replace with something more solid. He is not a vandal. He does not break what he does not mean to rebuild far better. The disruption is the first knock. The question is simply, painfully, beautifully, whether you will answer the door. There is a confusion so ancient, so deeply woven into the fabric of human thinking that most people never stop to question it. It is the quiet assumption that a man's worth is the arithmetic sum of his actions. That identity is merely biography with a moral score attached. We look at what we have done, and we conclude with what feels like reasonable logic that we now know what we are. The drunk believes he is his drinking. The adulterer believes she is her betrayal. The coward believes he is that one terrible moment in which he turned and ran. And the good, respectable, church-attending soul, perhaps the most dangerously deceived of all, believes he is his consistency, his service record, his unbroken attendance at the altar of decent behavior. All of them are wrong. Differently wrong, but wrong in the same direction. Grace does not merely forgive what you have done. That would be extraordinary enough and would demand a lifetime of gratitude. But grace does something far more structurally radical. It decouples identity from performance altogether. It drives a permanent wedge between the question, "What have you done?" and the question, "Who are you?" and refuses to allow the first to answer the second. This is not comfortable doctrine. It is, in fact, deeply unsettling, because performance is the one currency all of us, regardless of our theology, have been trained from birth to spend. We know how to earn. We know how to fail. We know how to improve and try harder and do better. What we do not naturally know, what must be given to us from outside ourselves entirely, is how to simply be in the presence of God without producing anything. Paul understood this at a level that cost him everything he had previously valued. He was, by the standards of his world and his religion, an extraordinary performer. He had the bloodline, the training, the zeal, the record. He catalogued it himself, not boastfully, but as a man holding up a balance sheet that has just been rendered meaningless by a new currency. He called it all loss, not worthless in itself perhaps, but worthless as a foundation for identity. The moment Christ met him on that road, Paul's performance was exposed as a costume, and beneath it, terrifying and magnificent simultaneously, was something that had never been manufactured by effort at all, a self that God had known and named before Paul had accomplished a single thing. This is the revolution hidden inside the gospel that we domesticate at our peril. We turn it into a better self-improvement program, sin less, love more, attend faithfully, and miss the earthquake entirely. The earthquake is this: you are not being improved, you are being replaced, not destroyed. God is not wasteful, but re-originated. Your identity is no longer rooted in your timeline. It is rooted in His eternal knowledge of you, and that knowledge predates your first sin and your finest moment equally. To receive this is not passive. It is, in fact, the most courageous act available to a human being. To stop performing, stop self-prosecuting, set down both the trophy and the prison sentence, and stand before God in the terrifying simplicity of being merely and wholly known. There is a peculiar and largely unexamined idolatry that modern men and women practice with extraordinary devotion, and it is this: the worship of the self-defined self. We have been told by philosophers who meant well, by therapists who were trying to help, by poets who were only half right, that the great task of human life is to discover who you are. And we have taken that instruction with such seriousness, such religious fervor, that we have built entire lives around the project of self-authorship. We sit with our journals, we take our personality assessments, we curate our stories, we decide with immense care and not a little pride who we shall be, and the result in almost every case is very small. Not because we are unimaginative, we are, many of us, enormously imaginative, but because we are working from the wrong materials. When a man defines himself, he can only draw upon what he already knows: his history, his wounds, his appetites, his modest repertoire of experiences. He is, in the deepest sense, a biased witness to his own case. He will, without knowing it, build a self that is shaped primarily by what he fears most and what he desires most, which are rarely the most truthful or most important things about him. The self he constructs will be, in the end, a monument to his own anxiety, dressed in the language of authenticity. This is what I mean by a small God, not small in the sense of harmless. Small gods can be tremendously demanding. Ask anyone who has lived under the tyranny of their own carefully constructed identity how exhausting the maintenance becomes, how every new experience must be filtered through the question of whether it fits the narrative, how friendships are quietly selected and quietly discarded based on whether they reflect the self one has decided to be. A small God is a full-time occupation. It simply does not pay. Now contrast this with what happens when God does the defining. And I want to be honest with you, it is not immediately comfortable. The God of Scripture has a long and somewhat alarming habit of telling people who they are before those people feel remotely ready to hear it. He tells a trembling shepherd hiding behind his sheep that he is a deliverer of nations. He tells a fisherman with a history of spectacular failure that he is a rock. He tells a murderer in the desert that he is a lawgiver. He tells a frightened young woman in an obscure village that she is blessed among all women who have ever lived. None of these people applied for the position. None of them, by their own self-assessment, were remotely qualified. And that is precisely the point. What God reveals about you cannot be arrived at by honest introspection because it exceeds what introspection can reach. It is not discovered inward, it is received from above. And what is received from above is always, without exception, larger, stranger, more demanding, and more glorious than anything the self-made self could have imagined or dared to claim. The danger, then, is not that you will think too highly of yourself. The danger is that you will settle with tremendous relief for thinking very precisely about yourself and call that self-knowledge. But the God who knit you together in your mother's womb was not working to your specifications. He had his own design. And until you lay down the portrait you have painted of yourself and ask him with genuine willingness to be surprised, to show you his, you will worship something real enough to feel true and small enough to keep you permanently diminished. The comfortable God is always the one we invented. The true God is always the one who invents us, again and again, into something we did not see coming. There is a profound and widespread confusion in the modern Christian mind about what it means to receive a prophetic word from God. we have inherited largely from the surrounding culture and its appetite for the spectacular, a deeply mistaken picture of prophecy as a kind of divine forecasting service, as though God were a heavenly weather bureau, issuing reports about events yet to come, telling you which city to move to, which person to marry, which career to pursue. And because we have swallowed this picture uncritically, we approach the prophetic with the wrong question entirely. We ask, what will happen, when the truer and far more searching question is, who am I? Let me put it plainly. When God speaks prophetically into a human life, his primary business is not prediction. His primary business is revelation. And the most important thing he wishes to reveal is not the shape of your future, but the shape of your soul, which is to say, the shape he originally gave it, before the world spent years pressing it into forms it was never meant to hold.